we do have the structural tight end advantage, or at least it has been a big advantage in the past. The first episode, I should say, edition of the Best Ball Workshop for 2022, I look at that tight end advantage. And I do note that a lot of this obviously is coming from just a couple of key guys. Those guys get hurt. Obviously, Travis Kelce gets hurt, and the numbers are going to change on this. But there are 4 to 6 players who are making a huge impact at the tight end position. It has been fairly consistent in terms of the scoring from those guys. And when you put those players in, it just massively supercharges your win rates. So Pete, when you're drafting, and obviously you mentioned in the first show how many drafts you've done already, you've got these builds for Underdog, you've got these builds for FFPC, especially in FFPC, it's going to make a big difference with the double flex and with the tight end premium. As you're looking at those first 3 rounds, obviously it's not something that just happens that you get the tight ends. You've got to pass on some other, very intriguing players to select them. Do you have a process that you like right now? Do you have guys from sort of the big 5 that you're really trying to load up on and others that you're trying to avoid? How is that working in your early drafts?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your article on that. And I think intuitively been drafting that way. I just know when I'm, whether it's on FFPC, I'm generally wanting to come out of the second round with one of those elite tight ends because they're not often there in the third round. And on Underdog in the same way, you're able to get them more in the 4th, 5th round. You're actually getting some discounts on those guys relative to last year where, Kittle and Waller really got pushed up and were routinely going at the back end of the second round. So yes, I always feel so much better about my teams when I'm able to get one of those guys. And I was actually doing a draft stream yesterday and someone asked in the chat, he said, are there any elite tight ends this year? And he was being a little reductionist there, but I get his point in saying that there's lots of holes that you can poke in all of these top 4 or 5 guys. I mean, you can go down the line and say, Kelce's getting older. Will the offense be different without Hill? Mark Andrews most of his production came when Lamar Jackson was at quarterback. You can go with Kyle Pitts. Will he connect with Mariota? Will this offense be able to sustain drives? George Kittle, he's been a blocker. Who's going to be their quarterback? Darren Waller, is he going to have to compete with Devontae Adams? Like, you can go down the line and poke holes. But the thing that was kind of crystallizing for me, in the same way when we do take a detour for a running back, we want to make sure it's a running back with, as Pat Crane says, with legendary upside. And we know there's injury risks and we know there's paths to failure. But if the stars do align, they give you such a massive structural advantage that your league mates can't keep up. And I do think that those 5 guys, and I know Sean's guy, Hockenson, maybe as well included in that conversation, they do have that potential to have the massive season where they separate from the field. And then, especially in the FFPC format, they're just giving you such a massive weekly point edge on your opponent. So I'm still all for chasing that legendary tight end upside this year.
What are maybe the biggest or the trickiest decision, when you're looking at those guys? Is there a spot, based on draft slot or, as you're moving through those rounds where it just gets really difficult because you're thinking, a Kittle or a Waller here would be great, but I have someone else that I just have to have on my teams? What's the hardest thing that you're having to do when you're taking that early tight end?
Yeah, I think I do mentally. I am giving a little extra weight to the tight ends. Like if I have 2 guys, if I'm looking at, I don't know, George Kittle and T Higgins, as much as I love T Higgins, I'm still going to break ties in favor of the tight end just for that structural advantage, and especially in best ball too, knowing that I can maybe make up for some firepower with volume later. But I think the toughest thing for me in drafts is, after I've gotten that elite tight end, thinking through how much to push that edge to my advantage as far as having more flexibility with the tight end 2 and tight end 3 roster spots. And obviously I don't want to just take, necessarily Kelce and then a last round guy that has no chance to give me points. And so kind of figuring out, based on the draft capital and the assumptions I've already spent on tight end, where and when can I get my tight end 2 and potentially tight end 3? In the same way, if you don't get an elite tight end and you're wondering, like in our RotoViz draft where I missed out and I ended up grabbing Dawson Knox and Gesicki, and then wondering, all right, can I get by with these 2? Can this be a 2 tight end build, or is it just thin enough that I need a 3 tight end build? So I'd say for me with tight end, that's the toughest thing, is really thinking through if I'm right, what additional, kind of reinforcements do I need at the same position?
And then just to take a quick little detour from the best ball for a second, you mentioned poking the holes in those top guys, and that very definitely true. And for me, that almost more of an issue or a consideration in some cases in Dynasty, although the flip side of that is that in Dynasty, you can kind of weather it, at least with maybe some of the younger guys. Do you have a preference among the stars for a Dynasty team, maybe in the tight end premium kind of thing, if people are doing a startup? Do you have a guy that you like there?
Yeah, I think, for me, when I look at these guys and start to think through cost and age, I mean, the three that would stand out for me would be Pitts, Kittle, and Hawkinson. And then I think I'd probably in, Dynasty be downgrading a little bit of Kelsey, Waller, and Andrews. I'm in a Dynasty league right now. It's not tight end premium, but Kelsey has been, just the anchor for my team for years now and has given me such a big advantage. And I'm kind of hemming and hawing because I have a team that I know can compete for a title again this year, but do I want to move off of him? And I've been in my head tossing around potential ideas of like, could I get Pitts plus, and I know that's going to be tough in some leagues, but trying to think through stuff like that. But yeah, I think I tend to, value those guys that are slightly younger. And I feel, more like their pure talent could carry them more so than the specific situations where I think maybe some of those other guys might be vulnerable to kind of changes in their environment.
Yeah, it can be hard to give up on those Kelce shares. With all that we do know, he's still such an edge at the position in Dynasty. You talked about the approaches of either getting the elite guy, maybe missing out on an elite guy and waiting, or how you're playing that. A question that came in from Tom Strachan, and it was around the fact that he says every year we hear tight end is deeper than it previously was. He writes that he thinks it looks pretty rotten this year, which is, and I think that's to do with the depth, not the top end. I think we have the top end guys there. But my approach in these leagues, particularly at the FFPC, is generally to get one of those guys as far as Hockenson being the last guy in that tier, and then usually going back and getting the guy in the 9th, 10th round and having two solid options because of the advantage, with the tight end position in the FFPC. But I do agree with Tom that when you get to beyond round 12, I would say there is not a huge amount of options that I'm thinking, or you mentioned the legendary upside. I don't think there's a lot of guys that are going to have top 12 upside once you go past that point. How do you approach that second tier of, once you go past maybe that 9 through 12 range? Do you think it's a huge drop off then? And do you like those guys in that kind of 9 through 12 range?
Yeah, no, I agree with that thought too. I feel, pretty gross once you're in that range. And, for best ball, honestly, I break most of my ties in favor of, stacking. Where it's like, okay, I'm going to grab Justin Fields, or I got Justin Fields. Okay, Cole Kmet starts to look a little nicer. Or, hey, I took Mac Jones, or I'm going to backdoor stack Mac Jones, Hunter Henry, maybe looks more attractive, and just trusting that correlation bump will make them a slightly better pick than in a vacuum. But yeah, I'm with you as far as guys that I get really excited about for, I don't know, let's say, outperforming their draft round by, or 4 or 5 rounds. I mean, there's a couple guys. I still think Noah Fant, just because of who he is as a talent, could maybe overcome some poor QB play. Gerald Everett with Justin Herbert is very intriguing to me. I feel like he, I know we're more excited about Alberto, but everyone's now excited about Alberto, and seeing, I'm looking at a draft right now where they have almost a 4.5 round difference in their ADPs. That seems a little rich to me as far as AFC West tight ends. So yeah, some of these younger guys, some of these guys who have changed teams where there's a little uncertainty on their role. And then other than that, just prioritizing the tight end with the stack. And that's what I did in our RotoViz Underdog League. A lot, I missed out on those elite tight ends. I'm not the biggest, Dawson Knox guy, but I took Josh Allen early. And if Josh Allen has a massive season, I think Dawson Knox will probably come along for the ride in a pretty decent way. So just kind of trusting that the correlation could take care of that.
Yeah, you mentioned it there as well, in terms of the underdog style of things. So I am going to touch on that in a second. I just do want to shout out that in one of the FFPC drafts this probably about a month ago, Shawn, that was the one that we drafted at 2 a.m. my time. We did get Alberto with the second last pick of the 20th round, which I think is looking pretty good at this particular point in time. So ADP has shifted quite dramatically since that point, obviously, with the trade off Noah Fant shortly after that. But how are we looking then when we get to somewhere like we talk a lot about the FFPC, we talk about tight end premium. Obviously, Underdog is 0.5 PPR and doesn't have a tight end premium advantage. So how then do you shift that approach? You mentioned about like breaking tiebreakers in favor of the tight end. Is that something that's solely for tight end premium, or are you doing that sometimes as well when it comes to Underdog drafting?
Yeah, I mean, on Underdog, I still really like getting that elite tight end because it generally means I'm going to only have to grab one more tight end. I will say in some of these really early contests, just knowing how much uncertainty and how many chances there are for injuries and offenses imploding, I have felt a little comfier with 3 tight end builds. And I think I talked about this on the Stealing Bananas episode, and then kind of pushing how willing I am to more extreme draft strategies as we get closer to the season. That's when I'm much more willing to do 2 QB builds, 2 tight end builds, really go hyper fragile stuff. But yeah, to me, I'm just constantly trying to do that mental calculation of what draft capital have I already spent on this position? If I'm right, what do I need at the bare minimum to still get by and make sure that if my stud guy does have a bad week, that I can continue to advance through these rounds. And that's the thing, even with some of these elite tight ends, like they're still going to have the weeks where Darren Waller gets 5 points. Can he go for 40? Of course, but you're going to need to think through how you're going to get by in those down weeks. And so, yeah, it's generally just thinking through what have I already spent and where do I need to devote more capital here.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.